Hi there. In this episode, we're going to examine the impacts of the constitutions on our rights on our society. So you need to realize that the government and our rights are in a delicate balance. Our government is based on the idea that its job is to protect individual rights and at the same time protect the common good, what's good for everybody. Now, these individual rights are rights that we've spoken about in the past. They're the rights expressed by John Locke and Thomas Jefferson, life, liberty, and happiness, as Jefferson said, or life, liberty, and property, as John Locke said. But it's important that we protect the common good as well, because our society would not be stable if we do not put the needs of the great over the needs of just one or two people. So, individual rights. When it comes to the Bill of Rights, there are three different kinds of personal freedoms that are protected. These are social freedoms, political freedoms, and economic freedoms. So let's look at our social rights first. These are freedoms associated with who you spend time with, freedom of association, peacefully assembling, speech, press. Of course, these are all protected by your First Amendment rights. They're social because we're talking about how you're interacting with other people. Next up are political rights. They include your right to petition, which again is a First Amendment right, but there are several other political rights that have been expanded over the course of American history. If we look at the 15th Amendment, this is one of what we call the Civil Rights Amendments that were passed right after the Civil War. The 15th Amendment provided voting rights for African American men. With the 19th Amendment, women too are going to be allowed to vote. With the 24th Amendment, we're going to abolish the poll tax, ensuring that nobody had to pay in order to vote. And then, of course, with the 26th Amendment, we're going to expand voting to those of a younger age, those of 18. We also have economic rights that are protected by the Constitution. So your right to own property, that natural right that Locke speaks of, is addressed in the 5th and 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. Within the 5th Amendment, though, the government has the right of what's known as eminent domain. What this means is that if a person's property can be taken by the government if it's for the common good. So let's say that the state is expanding I-95 and they're going to put a new exit, and that exit would go right over your house. The government can force you to sell their house. They have to pay for it, but they can force you to sell and relocate. That's eminent domain. Now, sometimes there's conflicts between individual rights and public interest. And there's been a few nasty occasions where this has happened in American history. By far, probably the darkest moment was during World War II. Now, what happened with World War II is we were attacked by the Japanese at Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941. And as a result, we enter World War II. We declare war on Japan and on Germany and Italy. What happens within a few months, though, is that Japanese American citizens, these are American citizens, are going to be forced into internment camps, basically prison camps by our government. The Supreme Court upheld this action in Korematsu versus the U.S. in 1944. The Supreme Court basically said that it was in the common good to protect the entire country from a possible Japanese threat than to protect the individual rights of Japanese Americans. On another note, though, we were also fighting Germany, but there were millions and millions of German Americans, and none of these actions were taken against them. Another example of how we have conflict between rights and public interest is a look at Jim Crow laws and the Civil Rights Movement. Following the Civil War, the Civil Rights Amendments were passed. That's the 13th Amendment, which ended slavery, the 14th Amendment that made African American citizens, and the 15th Amendment that allowed African American men to vote. Across the South, however, states put in local laws on the state and local level that were called Jim Crow laws. And the point of those Jim Crow laws were to keep African Americans from practicing their political freedoms. These Jim Crow laws basically legalized segregation, this idea that whites and blacks were not allowed to mix, and that you would have different restaurants, different buses, well, different schools, different section on the bus, different water fountains like what you see in the photo. And these Jim Crow laws, in a way, kind of neglected African American individual freedoms. Now, as a result, we're going to end up with the civil rights movement that hopefully you're familiar with. One of the basic tenets of the civil rights movement was a method called civil disobedience. And this is when you basically refuse to follow a law that you think is wrong. So to combat these Jim Crow laws, African American civil rights leaders would get arrested on purpose. Dr. Martin Luther King and other civil rights leaders would do this on a regular basis. They wanted to get arrested because by doing so, now they're in the court system and they could contend that the law itself was unconstitutional. So this was a way to challenge those Jim Crow laws in the courts themselves. Perhaps the most famous example of this is, of course, Rosa Parks. Unfortunately, most kids are taught in elementary school that, Rosa Parks was just this elderly woman who was too tired to give up her seat on the bus. That is a bunch of baloney. Rosa Parks worked for the NAACP, which is the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. The whole thing was planned. She refused to move as a form of civil disobedience, wanting to get arrested, wanting the laws to be changed. That's it for this time.